We are now in the third and last section of chapter 3, and this section is called The Problems of Continence. And this section has only two subheadings under it. And the first is called Self-Control and Objectivization. Okay, so we're talking about problems of continence, and so this particular section will give us some insight into what he means by the problems of continence. So objectivization, John Paul II means something specific, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So this section is related to the discussion on chastity. So when we talked about the true meaning of chastity, we touched on the fact that it's not just about moderation, but love is really at the heart of chastity as a virtue. When you're focused on love, loving properly, rather than just trying to moderate. And of course it is moderation, but love, he really brought that into the picture. And so this section kind of expands on that discussion. So again, he recalls the system of ethics based on Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. And just like how moderation was talked about, temperance or moderation. So in their system of thought, what's virtuous is that you're acting in accordance with reason. So there's our reason, our spiritual, what we can do spiritually, reasoning and willing. And then there are lower parts. And so the dictates of reason should kind of drive our action. So even though our lower parts, our bodies may want to do something that's not properly ordered, our reason tells us what is right and proper. And so with our will, we should do what is right. And in this process, we develop virtue and we grow towards perfection. And John Paul II, he adds to this way of looking at virtue and ethics. So he makes a point that it's not just about me and my perfection, or rather he explains what my perfection actually means. So rather than just it being something about me and me growing, it's about love. It's about me growing to love better, loving properly in the context of relationships. So rather than it's something I'm just improving on my own, I'm learning how to love properly, and that's driving how I grow and why I grow. So when it comes to chastity, it's the same thing. It's not just about me being able to moderate my feelings and sexual desires, but it's about me learning to love properly in relationships. People have different degrees of sexual or emotional excitability, and moderation, the absence of these excessive sexual feelings, that's not virtue, but it's about being able to maintain some equilibrium balance when the concupiscence does stir up. Okay, it's not just about the absence of like strong sexual desires, because somebody may naturally have very little desire, but when these concupiscence and these disordered feelings and desires, bodily desires, come up, you're able to kind of maintain some balance and for the right reasons. And that's what we want to get at. So when we think about trying to achieve self-control, we might think of the word continence. We want to have some type of self-control through continence. And the imagery he paints is that there are certain forces that are trying to act on us, and we're trying to say no to those through self-determination, protecting ourselves from some forces that's like making us think or act in a bad direction. But that's not the way to think of chastity, because it implies that the value towards body and sex, or desire for that, it's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean get rid of those things. In fact, he says running away from that can be a weakness, because chastity, it's not about weakness and running away. It's about strength and rising above those values of sex and body. I mean, sometimes you might have to avoid occasions of sin, that's different. But we're not afraid of the desire, the properly ordered desire towards body and sex. That's not the bad thing. What we want is strength in rising above that, higher goal. And the goal, self control in itself, continence, that's not the goal. And the goal is really love, okay? And so this is where the objectivization comes in. And what he means by objectivization is about ordering yourself towards objective values. There are lower values and there are higher values. The desire for body and sex, it would be a lower value. Affirmation of the value of the person, seeing the person for who they are, the fact that it's a person that should be loved and willing the good of that person, that's something higher. And objectivization is making sure that our desires are properly ordered and we're seeing the higher values as well. And so he gives an image of, it's kind of like grafting on. It's not like it's not about getting rid of emotions, feelings, sentimentality, sensuality. It's not about getting rid of those things, but it's grafting on of these higher values. Whenever we feel these emotions, we're not just a slave to these feelings and desires, but we're remembering always the higher values, the value of the person, remembering that I'm supposed to love that person and that person has an inner life and I must will that person's good. So, that's what he talks about. And so objectivization, about these ordering ourselves towards these objective values, that by itself is not virtue, because one can assent to these things and say, yes, like I agree these are high values, but at the same time, it may be disconnected from our actual desires. So, you want to moderate the desires in accordance with the higher values, with recognition of the value of the person. That's virtue. Like we have these desires, and we're not saying these desires are bad, but these desires are there, the bodily desires, and at the same time, we're remembering the higher value, the value of the person, and we have that together, and that's virtue. And this affirmation of the value of the person, so that's something we have to recognize intellectually, but he says it's important to try to feel the value of the person, to really feel it, not just in some abstract way think of it. And he says that this is where sentimentality can play a role. So recall the definition. Sensuality is about attraction to the body and sex. Sentimentality is about the attraction to the person of the opposite sex. You just want to be close to that person. So if we use that properly, it can help us to feel the value of the person. If we don't use that properly, it can degenerate into just sensuality, or just selfish, or enjoyment and emotion. But sentimentality can our attraction towards a person, desire to be close, can be useful in helping us feel that person's value. Okay. And so he concludes this section by talking about St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle again. And he articulates what they said in a different way, namely that our feelings and emotions, sensuality, sentimentality, those aren't enemies to eliminate, but he says they're rather allies. We want to use them in striving for authentic love. They'll help us to strive for authentic love. And now we come to the last part, which is titled Tenderness and Sensuality. So this section, Pope John Paul II pretty much talks about the role that tenderness plays and what it ought to be, and how it has the danger of giving way to sensuality if it's not properly integrated. So tenderness, it's about the feeling of closeness, all right? When two people become conscious of, their unity. And one person in tenderness, if I'm tender with somebody, I not only become aware of this other person's feelings, what they're feeling and thinking, but I really want to make that my own. I want to share in that person's thoughts and feelings. And so it's something intimate and interior, not an outward thing, but interior thing. And it arises from sentimentality. Again, the definition of sentimentality is about attraction to another person of the opposite sex, really wanting to be close to that person. So tenderness comes from that type of attraction. And it's different from sensuality, which is attraction, kind of a sexual attraction to the body and sex. So it's more of a wanting to be close to that another person. And so, that's what tenderness is, just wanting to be close together and share that person's thoughts and feelings. But you need to be careful against the tendency towards gratification. It feels like a good thing. We like this feeling of intimacy and closeness. And so tenderness can become more about that, gratifying my need for that feeling, because it feels good to be close with somebody. And so it can easily turn into something that's egoism, that's about myself. He says, Pope John Paul II says it has to be combined with a certain firmness and intransigence of will. There's supposed to be some type of a immovableness to the will and some certain firmness. And we can kind of see this in actual relationships. If a mom just wants to enjoy this tenderness with her child, then eventually the child's just going to be spoiled. And a good parent knows how to be strict with their child at times, balance that with, tenderness. The same thing with, things between a couple. If all they want to do is just be tender with each other and nothing more than that, then it's not going to be a good relationship, because when it's going to become about the emotions, when the emotions fade, the relationship is going to become sour. So when there's no true love, like your will isn't fixed on the good of the other, then tenderness can become empty gestures. It can just become about emotions. Especially in a relationship between a man and a woman, a romantic relationship, that tenderness, it can easily diverge from love of the person, and which is the right direction, and go in the opposite direction, towards sensual or emotional egoism, he says. It can easily, rather than tenderness taking us to love, it can easily diverge into selfishness. In a relationship, the subjective elements of love grow much quicker than the objective elements, he says. And what do we mean by that? The emotional aspects, how I feel, and the connection, this tenderness. All these things develop like much more quickly than the more important aspects of love, such as commitment, really being focused on the value of the person, willing that other person's good. Those things, the more important things, take time. But tenderness, emotions, even sensuality, especially sensuality, all of that can kind of really grow really quickly. And so you need to be, careful about that. If you're unaware of this dynamic, then you can easily, base your understanding of love on these more superficial aspects, and then it'll turn into egoism rather than develop into true love. So with tenderness, there comes responsibility to not just enjoy the emotionally pleasant aspects of tenderness, but to really allow the objective elements of love to mature, for the tenderness to take the relationship in the right direction. And John Paul II kind of paints a picture of what that mature tenderness looks like. He talks about it's how much more a matter of steady participation of emotion. So not just a sudden rush, or I really enjoy this moment, not that type of a thing, but it's something just kind of steady. And he says it's a durable commitment to love. That there's a sense of commitment in that tenderness, where it's not just about how I feel, but this emotion is leading me to be committed to you. Talks about an interior climate of communicativeness. I want to constantly share and listen to what's in your heart and your thoughts. That tenderness is leading to those things. So those are signs of tenderness, growing in the right direction, a more mature tenderness. So, tenderness it has to be combined with a love of the person, really, doing what's good for that person. And it has to be disinterested. Disinterested doesn't mean uninterested. It means, not, there's no self-interest. Okay, there's a detachment from self-interest. So when there's that detachment from my self-interest and focused on the love of the person, tenderness can play a very important role in a relationship. Both men and women, but even especially more so for the women, who are generally in a greater need than men of tenderness. Although both do need it, women do need it more, according to John Paul II. And so he mentions difficult life experiences of women that only they experience, such as pregnancy, childbirth, and all that goes with them, child raising. There are aspects of, all of that only women can really, really experience. And in those moments, when a man really, and the husband really tries to be one with her in terms of her feelings and thoughts, that could be a tremendous support for the woman. And I think men want to, be that for the woman, even if they can't articulate that this is, what's needed. So if tenderness, all this is about tenderness taking on its proper character, what it's supposed to be. So there needs to be some type of, continence and self-denial, in order for tenderness to take on its proper character and be really focused on love and the good of the person.